Right, so I work at the BBC. Anyone not heard of the BBC? Thank goodness, all right. And I run a team that makes enterprise apps. I know, I'm sorry. I promise it's a lot more glamorous than it sounds. We make cool stuff. We make apps that journalists use. We make apps that staff can find details of other staff on. Okay, maybe that's not so glamorous. I've got about 85 different apps in my portfolio. So I manage quite a lot of stuff. Product management, going into my talk, is, I think, split into three things, and that is design, technology, and people. And people, I split into two bits. Users. We talk a lot about users, end users, what they need. How do you find out what users want? How do you then put that into your product? One thing we don't really chat about much is stakeholders. So I'm just going to share some thoughts that I have on some stakeholders that I work with. I'm hoping you'll recognize some of the stakeholders I work with as well, as stakeholders in your industries, in your areas, and hopefully I'll give you some tips to be able to manage those stakeholders a bit better. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about stakeholders themselves. So, when I'm talking about stakeholders, I mean the people that are really interested in your product, but they're not end users. So they might be your chief technology officer. They might be the person who manages the legacy system. I know, I work in enterprise, I'm sorry. The legacy system that you have to integrate with. They might be a development team that you have to work with. There might be a marketing team. There are lots of people within your own business or connected to your business that aren't end users, that influence or are part of your product. So, normally not holding stakes. Why is it called stakeholder? Anyone? Yeah, me neither. So, I'm not going to talk exhaustively about all the different types of stakeholders out there because we will be here for hours. But I'm just going to talk about four main types. So, before we go into those four types, I'm going to stick with talking about stakeholders for a second. Not all stakeholders are equal. So, we think the end user is really key. I agree, the end user of your product is really key. But your stakeholders also have quite a lot of input into how you develop your product, the things that you bear in mind when you make your product, and what happens at the end of your product. Does it go end of life? Do you add more features in? Do you integrate with other systems? So when I say not all stakeholders are equal, I'm talking about two things. There's seniority. So your chief technology officer is going to have some really strong feelings about what should and shouldn't happen to your product. But also, the person that sits on the desk next to you, that sees what you're doing, is also going to have some views on your product. They're not the same kind of stakeholder. One of them has what I call hard power, which is basically you can't say no to them. And the other is soft power. They can gently influence, oh, don't know if that looks that good, or why don't you just shift that to the left, or have you thought about a completely different color scheme? I saw this app once that did. I mean, we all have those colleagues, right? So, they're not all equal in terms of your seniority. There's also a real bugbear of mine is when people say marketing people are ... and then reel out a load of stereotypes. Or developers are ... and reel out a load of stereotypes. Because I have a team, the majority of who are developers, and I can tell you, they are all completely different from each other. There's no typical developer. So when we start to segment our stakeholders and say, developers just need really concise bits of information that allow them to then create the product, that's not very helpful, because one of your developer stakeholders might be really loud and shouty and bully everyone else. And so their views will be more important, potentially, than the other people in the team. And you might have to influence them differently from how you would somebody who is less vocal. So that's what I mean by not equal. There are different levels of power. Soft power, your kind of democratic soft power, Hard power, absolutely have to do it. And there's stereotyping, which I think is useful in some scenarios, but a little bit dangerous. There's also, people like to say, this person is this, or this person is that. There are two things that they do. They do black and white thinking, which is where you have to put things in one category or another. They can't be both. Or they have groupthink, where everyone else thinks something, so they have to think it too. So, controversially, I'm going to ask a question. Put your hand up if you think that Donald Trump is an excellent president. Some of you might think he is, but you're not going to put your hand up. The reason you're not going to put your hand up is because you don't want anyone else in the room to notice that you think that. That is groupthink, and that happens all the time. So be a little bit careful about assuming things about someone and saying that they are this or they are that, because people do some really weird things in different situations, and they are not the same person in every single situation. If they have a home life, do you imagine that they're being a dick at home? Maybe, but probably not all the time, in the same way that sometimes I'm a bit of a dick, and sometimes I'm not. That doesn't mean that I'm fundamentally good or bad, it just means I'm human. All of your stakeholders, they're all human. So there'll be some things that they do that's bad behaviour, but you've got to think about, why is that happening? What kind of pressures are they under to make some really weird decisions? Like this guy. He just wanted to make a Death Star, and everyone else kept criticising him. Maybe he had pressures from other people around him that put him into the position where he felt that he had to. I'm not going to talk about why you should have a better relationship with your stakeholders, because I imagine every single one of you already knows this. If you have a great relationship with people, it's easier to get things done. If you can influence people, it makes your job much easier. High quality products, obviously, if you're not just wasting time talking round and round, it makes it a lot easier to make changes. Obviously, you spend less time on it, so you've got cost savings, you get an easier life, you get a better night's sleep. Right, so you're probably wondering, what are those 4 types you keep talking about? So let's get into it. I was going to do a field guide in the kind of David Attenborough style, and I thought maybe that wasn't quite appropriate, so we're just going to have to do it as me, I'm afraid. First stakeholder, big name on campus. I've given them more titles, just because I could. So this is the person who comes into a meeting, they're energetic, they probably have a cult following, they probably have a group of people that absolutely adore them. They are really, really well liked in the business. Really well liked. They swan into the meeting, full of ideas, and they're saying, I've got this great idea, and it's going to solve all of these problems. Everything's going to be solved. My idea is going to be the thing. And the people around them, let's go back to groupthink, will all go, yeah, you know what? They've got this really good idea. Let's do it. We have to do it. We have to get this thing done. Dangerous stakeholder, because you have to manage them really carefully. Otherwise, they start making some really strange decisions about your product. Next one. Dictator. So, I'm sure you all know a dictator. This will be the person that says, no, we're doing it this way. And you can present all the data in the world to say, actually, the users at the end of the day want to do this thing. And they'll just completely ignore it because whatever they say goes. Hard power. They've got their own agenda. And they're just going to come into the meeting and going to say, your product's great, but it doesn't do this thing. So you have to do it all over again. Teflon Tonys. Anyone know the phrase Teflon Tony? It comes from Tony Blair. I'm not going to make this political, don't worry. This nickname came from the fact that nothing could stick to him. These are the people who don't want to do any work. There might be some things going on for them. Maybe they're scared to do the work. But yeah, they actively avoid doing anything because they don't want it to fail. And if it fails, they want it to be somebody else's problem. These are, again, slightly dangerous stakeholders because they'll do whatever they can to change history. They'll say, well, I didn't agree to it. That wasn't my thing. That was your thing. Didn't we agree in that meeting that you were going to do the thing? And they will never give you what you need on time. Anyone recognize this person? I'm seeing some nods. Fearful controllers. So we might call them control freaks. These are the people that are distant for a while, and then suddenly they'll rush in and say, that feature that you're working on, that thing you're doing, where is it? It's not doing the thing I need. Why isn't it doing the thing I need? They'll set a separate meeting up, even though 6 months prior, you agreed exactly what the feature was going to do. You invited them to the meeting. They just didn't listen. They didn't even come to the meeting. And 6 months later, they decided to undo all of that work. So I'm going to go into each of these a little bit separately. I'm not going to focus too long on them, but just give you a little idea of how you recognize them. If you do want to take pictures, feel free, that's what they're there for. Big name on campus, they love meetings, they love talking, they love coming in with an idea. They'll say things like, you know what, they all want this thing, they want it to be green. The end users have told me, all of them have told me, it needs to be green. They probably haven't. You cannot believe everything they say. I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is all about tips for them. You'll see the top one on the right is, don't believe everything they say. You've got to take what they say with a pinch of salt. They might represent some people. You can't always guarantee that they've actually spoken to them. In fact, they probably haven't. Also, don't ignore them. Remember, they're really popular. You don't piss off the popular kid. You've got to get them on side. So how do you do that? You didn't ask that question, but great question. You flatter them. When they come to the meetings, you ask them about something they're an expert in. People love it when you treat them like experts. You let them talk. You give them the space. You give them specific topics to talk about. And you have separate catch-ups with actual end users separate from them, so you can verify what they're saying. You should also catch up with them though, because if you don't, they might then circle back round and give you some more features that the end users haven't asked for. Dictator. This person doesn't really come to all your meetings, but the one meeting they do come to, everyone else is panicking because they're at the meeting. Everyone's scared. They'll just agree to anything they say in the room. Hard power, right? What can you do with hard power? They want specific things. So I suppose the thing about the dictator is, actually isn't that they want to undo all of your work. Again, go back to not good or bad. The problem with the dictator is they can't quite express these 1 to 2 things that are really important to them. They've got a separate agenda. They've got other conversations going on. There are maybe 2 things that impact your product, impact the feature you're building, that they actually care about. So you kind of need to try and unpick a little bit with a dictator about what's going on for them. Work closely with their advisors. So this is an interesting one. Dictators will often have maybe 2 to 4 people that they rely on for everything. Everything. Even if those people don't know about them, which is stupid, but that's what they do. You've got to get into the inner circle. You don't want to be part of the inner circle because that could get really stressful, but you want to understand what's actually going on for them. What's their agenda? What do they need? What can you give them? Because the second that you give them those 1 to 2 things, they will disappear. And what happens after that is you don't have any more of those difficult meetings where they come in and change everything. They're happy, which means you've got the freedom to do whatever you need to with your product. Don't ignore them. The second that you ignore a dictator, they get panicked and they will keep using their hard power. And they will keep using their hard power until you leave. So yeah, don't ignore them. Teflon Tonys. You might be wondering why I've given them names. It's just because I thought it was kind of fun. Teflon Tonys are a really interesting one because these are the people I often come into contact with in my work, which is enterprise, I don't know if I mentioned that. These are the people that really get excited about the workshops. They want to come to the meetings. They turn up, they get the Post-it notes, they've got everything on the wall. And then when you start saying, okay, so you're going to take that bit, they go, oh, yeah, maybe we can, or are you sure that you can't do it? Or, yeah, I think it's a really good idea, but... So they're a little bit tricky to manage. I'd say if you're working with anyone who is avoiding taking any responsibility for doing things, do whatever you can to isolate them from your project. Because you're not going to deliver anything if people aren't supporting you. And they don't support you. They'll come back a month later, they'll say, where's the product? And you'll say, yeah, you were supposed to be building this thing. And they go, what? But I thought you agreed to do that. So yeah, I would, as much as possible, remove any influence from Teflon Tonys. But you can't, right? Sometimes you have to work with them. So here are some tips. Top one, roles and responsibilities. We talk about this a lot in stakeholder management, is doing what we call RACI matrices, where you put responsibility, accountability, whether you consult them, whether you inform them. If you don't know what a RACI matrix is, look it up. They are really, really important for our Teflon Tonys. If you have a clear structure, a clear project plan, and clear deliverables, you can work with these people, but you do need to invest a lot of your time checking in. They are a time suck. Last but not least, fearful controllers. These are our controlling, slightly neurotic, panicky people. They love meetings, but they never turn up. They've always got something else on. They might say things like, yeah, do you know what, it's a really great idea, but here are a list of a million reasons why we can't do that, and why we have to do the thing that I want to do. They throw spanners in your projects all the time. You can't get stuff delivered. What can you do with a fearful controller? Well, the thing about fearful controllers is, don't do roles and responsibilities for these people. Don't define those, because they're not going to listen. They don't care. They just want to have control because it makes them feel good about the thing that you're building. If they have control over that feature, then they're happy. You need to create a safe space with them. What I mean by that is a space where they can trust you. And this takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, but it is worth it, because it means that they will listen to you. Paraphrase things back to them. Make sure that you're actually engaging them with a conversation, but away from meetings. The thing I do is I accidentally bump into people. I'm a remote worker. So sometimes I'm in the office when I have catch-ups with my team. And there are people that I have on my list. And these are the people that I will walk around the office in circles until I bump into them, just so I can have a really casual conversation about something that's going on with them. So then you build a bit of rapport. It doesn't have to be about the actual product itself, because the second that they trust you, they'll actually rely on you in those meetings to be able to deliver back to them accurate information, and they won't question what you're doing. I'm going to briefly talk about soft power. I'm not going to go into each of these. Please take a picture if you're interested, if you're unsure how to deal with people that are using diplomacy, or maybe they're subtly undoing you. This is all about how you build that rapport, particularly for your fearful controllers. They're not fearless. And this is also how you can deal with your big names on campus. These are great techniques for them. The ultimate goal is you want them to think the same thing as you. You want to take them from being us to being together. So I would say, this is going back to that kind of groupthink mentality. Think of how you can approach a situation where you can bring them into the room so they are forced almost to agree with everyone else. So you talk to other people separately to agree things before the meeting. Then they come to the meeting, and they have to agree because no one else will back them up, or everyone else seems to have a consensus already. We've also got another few techniques you can use. Body language, be open, smile. It's actually kind of interesting just how much being nice will take you forward. I mean, it doesn't cost anything to be kind to people. And it doesn't cost anything to be kind and generous to people when they're being dicks to you. It's really hard, but it's actually strange how much that transforms your relationship with someone if you are forgiving of their behavior. Allow time in meetings for people to just raise stuff. Don't rush through and ignore them. If people don't feel listened to, they won't engage with you. And there are a couple of other things you can do. The RACI matrix I mentioned. You can use stakeholder management maps. You can look at the kind of power axis, the interest axis. You want to focus on the people who are high power, high interest. Then you want to focus on the people who are low power, high interest. They're the people that will engage with your product. They'll help you. They'll help drive through change. And I'd say, watch the assumptions you're making. That's the thing about, are you collectively agreeing something as a group? Have you isolated someone because you think they're bad? Are they bad at their job? Are they actually bad at their job? Maybe they're in the wrong job. Maybe their boss is actually giving them advice that isn't helping them. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're psychopathic. You never know. But be forgiving and be understanding of people, and that will take you far. Right, so summary, stakeholders, people, treat them like people. Don't just split them down into groups and assume things about them. Assumptions are really bad. We've got our 4 common stakeholder types. You've got some tips on how to tackle them. Tailor your approach. Again, talking about developers and teams, different people are different. So figure out whether they prefer face-to-face meetings. What type of person are they? Big personality? Yeah, they're not going to want the kind of direct, concise updates. They're not going to be constantly flooded. Think about how you're contacting people. And go back to my earlier slide, just don't build a Death Star. And that's me over. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kaz. We have time for just a couple of questions. So I think this one I share, actually.
Great.
I think I heard you say 85 products?
Pardon?
You have many products in your portfolio.
Yeah, I've got 85 at the moment.
Why? Okay, so this first question is, how do you define products at BBC?
It's a good question. So we have different areas in the BBC. I'll try and keep concise on this one. We've got some of our external-facing products, and that's what we call things like iPlayer or BBC Sounds. There's also a platform that sits underneath all of those things, allows people to deliver updates. So how do you get an image from a journalist in the field? How do you get that? It's what we call ingesting. How do you ingest that content into a system and then pull it out and then show it on BBC News at 10? And how do you do that workflow within 5 minutes? All those separate areas, the platform bit, the connection between the platform and a mobile app or whatever they're using to capture the footage, and then between the actual system and then the output on television, there are about maybe 8 or 9 teams doing that. So separated into product teams. So BBC Sounds is a team primarily working on the front end, but they don't interact with the platform. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the platform's separate from the actual sort of product that sits on top of it, but it's all interconnected. Yep.
What are the positives that these stakeholder personalities have?
I mean, yeah, I know I was going to say something, but obviously because there's quite a lot of content there, I just wanted to get through it about things that might be good about these people. As I say, people aren't good or bad. These aren't like good or bad people. It's just behaviours that can really derail your product. And those are the things that you just want to look out for. So, I mean, your dictator might actually be an awesome night out. It doesn't mean that you can't have a really decent conversation with them. This is specifically talking about behaviours that happen in an environment where people feel invested in your product.
Just going to follow on that idea of someone derailing it. Is there an example or a case you can share where you've had to say no to a stakeholder?
There have been lots of times where I've said no to stakeholders. Lots and lots of times. One of the more recent ones was actually they were talking about showing Yeah, I'm going to tell you about this one. They're thinking about showing different diversity data in one of our systems, which is great. I think be more transparent about the data that we've got internally and show that so we know how far we also have to go. I'm a big fan of making sure that we are able to share some of the statistics that we've got, particularly around diversity and inclusion data. They wanted to use the phrase white majority, and I didn't think that was appropriate. A similar situation happened where they wanted to say male and female rather than men and women. And they didn't mean much to the senior people who were just making those decisions. They just liked the words. And I said, well, have you considered that male and female is a little bit biological, and there are some people who might not fit those categories, who might then end up feeling a little bit insulted or upset. This is a system they use every day. Imagine how they feel going into those situations. That's the conversation I had with the trusted advisors that sit around the dictators that we have who are making those decisions. And they waft that information up. That's a really horrible phrase, isn't it? But yeah, they waft the information up. So it means that person then slightly changes it. Or we focus on saying, well, if you want to make this small text change, which to me is going to take me all of about 30 seconds, actually there's a big long process that we've got to follow, and we might not actually be able to do that for, 18 months. So is it really that important you want to wait for 18 months? And then they say, oh yeah, that's fine, we'll just leave it as it is then. So I would say, I'm being very honest here, I would say sometimes slightly misleading people can help you get the things that you need if you think it's the right thing for the product.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and I think someone's having a spark of self-awareness, perhaps. If you recognize yourself in any of these different personas, any advice on how to maybe modify behavior?
I would say, actually looking at some of those do's and don'ts of how people work with you is be aware of how people interact with you. Are they behaving scared? Are the things that they're doing causing you to behave in a certain way? A lot of this is about emotional intelligence, to be honest. That's fundamentally what all of this is. What's going on for you that might cause those behaviours to happen? And then what response are you getting back? Because you might find that being a little bit open and saying, well, actually, I feel quite stressed about this, and that might make me do this, can really help win people over. And they might then change the way that they connect with you. I would say if you are in any doubt or you are in any way concerned that some of these things might derail or upset things in a project or product feature or any other thing that you're doing as part of your work, I would have a conversation with the other person, because they're also a stakeholder to you, right? If you're in a situation where that's happening, that seems to feel, the fact that you've asked that question, important to you. I would sit down with them and have a conversation about it, and then try and rebalance and start from there. Be vulnerable, actually. Be vulnerable, be open. Because the more vulnerable and open you are, the more vulnerable and open people will be back to you. And the more that you can sweep away all the assumptions, all the unconscious bias, and actually just have a decent conversation with someone.
That is an excellent, excellent point to leave this off. Thank you so much, Kaz.
Thank you.
We're just